you very much for having me come and speak to you. So I'm going to speak to you about the gender data gap and the guy that I have dubbed the worst superhero in the world. He's called Reference Man. And his superpower is being able to represent all of humanity. What a guy. I'd like to open and introduce Reference Man to you with a little morality tale. It's about what happens to anyone who is foolish enough to make a joke about feminists. So this happened in Sweden. It started in Sweden, as a lot of feminist things do, in a town called Karlskoga. The local government departments were doing a gender audit of all their policies, which is, again, because it was Sweden. And someone made a joke that they should probably look into the snow clearing, because even feminists can't make snow clearing sexist. It was a very foolish man. You never, ever throw the gauntlet down to a feminist, because of course we made snow clearing sexist. And here's how. So the way they had always done snow clearing in the past had been, and the way it is still done in a lot of countries and cities around the world, is to clear the major roads first, and only then move on to the local roads and the pavements. But it turns out this is biased towards male travel patterns. So men and women tend to travel in different ways. Men tend to travel in a much more simple way, a twice daily commute, in and out of work, driving a car. Women, both because they tend to have less money than men, and also because even when a household has a car, men tend to dominate access to it, women are more likely to use public transport, and they have more complicated travel patterns because of their unpaid care work. So women do 75% of the world's unpaid care work. In the UK and the US, they have 5 fewer hours of leisure time than men. And the result of this is that they don't get to do just a simple twice daily commute. They have to, for example, drop the kids off at school before going into work, pick up the groceries on the way home, maybe drop in on an elderly relative. So they do this thing called trip chaining, lots of short interconnected trips into suburbs, not necessarily in a straight line. So they decided, well, we'll switch it, because they figured it wouldn't cost them any more money, and after all, it's probably harder to push a buggy through 3 inches of snow than to drive a car slowly through 3 inches of snow. What they didn't expect was that it would save them money. So it turned out that the admissions to A&E during the winter months fell significantly, because actually they were right, it was harder to push a buggy through 3 inches of snow, and it wasn't the men who were turning up at A&E having crashed in the snow, it was women turning up, having fractured their bones by falling over on the icy conditions. The cost of A&E in the winter months was 3 times the cost of the winter road maintenance. So the moral of the story is, sexism doesn't have to be deliberate, and feminism saves you money. So the snow clearing schedule was devised on data that had a gender data gap. And the men who devised it, and it would have been men back then, because this was just one of those, this is the way we've always done things, it obviously makes sense kind of process. They knew how they traveled, and they designed it around their needs. They didn't deliberately set out to exclude women. They just forgot about them. They assumed that Reference Man could represent everyone. Turns out his superpower is not as great as he had perhaps thought. And relying on Reference Man in this way is not unusual, and having a gender data gap is not unusual. So I first came across the gender data gap, although of course I didn't call it that back then, in my own head. I was 25 and I was at university as a mature student, and I was absolutely not a feminist. I grew up not being a feminist. I grew up thinking, well, I grew up in the 90s, and anyone female knows what that means who's around my age. Feminism was definitely a dirty word. The only thing I knew about feminism was that I was not a feminist. Women were, I believed all the stereotypes about women. Women are trivial, over-emotional, hysterical, irrational, trivial, superficial, and I was more like one of the guys, like all of my female friends were. We were like more like one of the guys, and we actually talked about it. But definitely not a feminist. Men and women were equal now, and if women weren't doing as well as men, well, probably women should consider being less shit at things. And and then maybe they would do better. Anyway, so then I got to university, and I had to pick up this book called Feminism and Linguistic Theory, which may not sound like a banging read, but it absolutely is. And it turned me into a feminist. So I read this section on the male default. Again, this is reference man rearing his ugly head again, in language. And it was talking about male default pronouns, so he to mean he or she, man to mean humankind. And I think like a lot of people, this is one of those things about feminism that does kind of trickle down. It does percolate through society. Most people have heard that feminists get really worked up about he to mean he or she. And I think like a lot of people, when you just hear it, I just thought, what a load of rubbish. God, feminists are so ridiculous. Haven't they got anything better to worry about? But then the next thing that I saw, the next line in the book, was that when women hear these words, they picture a man. And that just completely blew my mind, because I realized for the first time that I was picturing a man whenever I heard these words. And more than that, I thought, I'm 25. How have I never noticed this before? How have I been picturing men all the time, and it's only now that it's pointed out to me that I'm noticing? And as I thought about it more, I realized that actually it wasn't just when I was listening to or reading male default words. It was also supposedly gender-neutral words like politician, scientist, professor, journalist, doctor, writer. Any time that I didn't know the sex of the person that we were talking about, I was picturing a man. And then I couldn't help wondering if that was in any way connected to the way that I had so easily bought into this stereotype of what women are, rather instead of not knowing any, despite not knowing any women like that, I just believed it, and just thought, well, must not be like other women. Anyway, it turns out it's not just me that's picturing men all the time. It's all of us, and as you can see, the poor guy down on the bottom there with whatever he has is more likely to be a human than a female. And in fact, when I was researching my book, Invisible Women, I came across this really quite shocking, actually. I mean, it's not that shocking anymore, but I remember when I came across it, I was actually quite surprised that they looked at 5 gender-neutral words: user, participant, person, designer, and researcher, and told people to draw what they pictured when they heard those words. And for all of the words for men, it was about 80% male. 80% of the time they were drawing men. But women weren't much better. Women, it was about 70% of the time they were drawing men. The only time that it was 50-50 for women was the word person. So, I guess that's silver lining. Women are aware that women are as likely to be people as men. But not user, participant, designer, or researcher. In fact, researcher for men was more likely to be depicted as a person of no gender than as a woman. I don't really know what you would make of that. So I just want to give you a few examples, more examples, of the way that we tend to mean male when we think we're talking gender neutrally, because it is pretty endemic. So, as you can see here, Lego teacher, time, minifigure, watch and clock, Lego teacher, time teacher, girl, minifigure, watch and clock. The male gets to occupy the default, the standard, the female is the marked one. Similarly here, awesome girl, awesome kids, deodorant. This is in Walmart. They just really felt that it was important that you knew where the women's deodorant was. Someone just sent me this the other day. As you can see, it's the same ingredients, but more expensive and pink. Great. So, this is one of my favorite products of all time. Bic for Her. And, people were quite mean to Bic when this came out. And I thought, well, let's give Bic a chance to explain themselves. Because, women do have on average smaller hands than men. Maybe Bic has done some really interesting research and they've come up with a really great pen for women's hands. It's possible. So I sent them an email with 10 questions. When was this new pen for women designed and why? The product is marketed as designed to fit comfortably in a woman's hand. Could you let me know exactly what this means? Has there been research into how the original Bic pen does not fit comfortably in a woman's hand? Did you base your design of the new pen on research into women's hand size and/or grip strength? If so, could you point me towards the research? What exactly were the design changes that were made in order to ensure that the pen did fit comfortably in a woman's hand? Was the new pen tested in women users? Was the original Bic pen tested in women users? Is the original Bic pen unsuitable in any way for women's hands? So then followed about 10 days and multiple emails back and forth from the poor marketing department at Bic, this annoying feminist. And they were just like, we're really just working to get the right information together for you. We want to make sure that we've got everything just right. Anyway, so they finally got back to me with the following. Dear Caroline, thank you for taking the time to send us your questions regarding Bic for Her. First and foremost, as a company, Bic is very sensitive to gender issues and supports empowerment and the emancipation of women. And then followed some bump about their company missions, which I won't bore you with. And this is the important part. Prior to launching any of our products, we systematically carry out consumer research and conduct consumer feedback sessions for us to determine how well we respond to demand and taste. Specifically with the Bic for Her range, our objective was to meet the taste of our fashion-oriented customers through a high-quality, attractive writing instrument for which we created specific design, features, and packaging. When we launched it in 2009, we received positive feedback and comments from consumers. Bic for Her range has now been discontinued. Anyway, I tried several times to get to the bottom of their research process, but they never really gave me a straight answer, and I'm afraid I never did find out if the original Bic pen was unsuitable for women's hands. So all I can say is, ladies, use with caution. So anyway, I've known for a while that male default reference man is a thing. I knew that sexism was a thing. I knew, as many people know, that women are chronically underrepresented in the media. Only 24% of the persons is 50% female, by the way, guys. Persons heard, read about, or seen in newspaper, television, and radio news at the last count, which was exactly the same as the previous count 5 years earlier, so we've been stuck at 24% for a while now. In politics in the UK, only 26% of the House of Lords, 32% of the House of Commons are female. You may remember those recent Brexit talks that Theresa May held at Chequers, where all the men turned up in their fancy cars. There were more men called Steve there than there were women discussing the future of our country. In films, only 26% of speaking roles in family-rated Hollywood films go to women. In banknotes, we have got a woman now, but only one. In statues, there are more statues of men called John than there are statues of female historical figures. So I knew all this. I was campaigning on this. But what I didn't know was that this bias extended to numbers, it extended to science, and it extended to medicine. And perhaps naively, I had thought that the gender bias I knew existed in our cultural life wouldn't appear here, because these are areas that we are told are objective. They are based on facts, and therefore they're nothing for feminists to worry our annoying little heads about. But we made that sexist too. So I first became obsessed with the gender data gap in science when I was researching my first book. And I came across that heart attack symptoms were not exactly what I had been taught they are. So as you can see from the Google search results, only men have heart attacks, and it's always pain in the chest. And that's what I thought gender-neutral heart attacks are. It's how heart attack symptoms are. But it turns out that is not what heart attack symptoms are for women. So women are more likely to experience breathlessness, nausea, fatigue, what feels like indigestion. And because we don't teach this, we don't provide this information in public health info, women don't realize they're having a heart attack. And so they don't take themselves to the doctor, as in fact they should. And in fact, only 1 out of 8 women will experience chest pain when they're having a heart attack. So that was the first thing. But the second and more shocking thing was that it wasn't just that women weren't realizing they were having a heart attack, it was also that doctors were misdiagnosing them. In fact, women are 50% more likely to be misdiagnosed if they have a heart attack than men. Women are more likely to die following a heart attack than men because doctors are not diagnosing them, because women don't realize they're having them, and also because the tests that we've developed don't work for women as well as they work for men because they've been designed around reference man's form of a heart attack. So, for example, one of the main tests is looking for blockages. Well, it turns out that female heart attacks may not present with blockages in the same way. So then you have this situation where you have women who did have chest pain, you know, they happen to fall into the classic symptoms bracket, they have this test, and then they get sent home with undiagnosed chest pain. Of course, so that can then go on to die. So this can be fatal. I also discovered that in animal studies, reference man rules here too. 90% of studies are done on male animals, the excuse being that female animals are too hormonal and menstrual. And the result is, of course, that women have less effective treatment and more side effects. Women also have more serious adverse drug reactions, which means they're more likely to be hospitalized when they have them. And of course, you know, the argument around the menstrual cycle really doesn't make sense. It's one that comes up again and again and again. And it never fails to make me angry because the excuse is that the menstrual cycle will impact on the findings. And that's why you need to study the menstrual cycle, because the menstrual cycle exists out in the wild, even if you manage to exclude it as a confounding factor from your drug tests. And what we have found when we do bother to study the menstrual cycle is that, yes, it does impact the findings, sometimes in a very serious way. For example, there are heart arrhythmia drugs that we have since discovered are more likely to trigger a heart attack in the first half of a woman's menstrual cycle. It's kind of an important thing to have discovered before you put the drug out on the market. So anyway, discovering this, I was incredibly shocked. And I was shocked that I didn't know it was happening. Why wasn't everyone talking about this? Why wasn't this front page news? How was it that I, a professional feminist, had never read about this before, and it was just appearing in some obscure paper that I happened to come across because I was researching a book? Since then, I have found that the results of the gender data gap appear everywhere. So a lot of the women in the audience will know exactly what's going on here. It may have happened to you as you came in here today. Transport infrastructure, as well as snow clearing, it's also about things like women not being able to reach the rails. We are in the Barbican, which famously was torn down by Samira Ahmed on Twitter a few years ago for having made their toilets gender neutral, but only by switching over the signs. So the issue with toilets is that it's in plumbing codes that you have equal floor space for men and women. The problem with that is that you can fit far more urinals into a certain amount of floor space than you can fit cubicles. So already, as soon as you have equal floor space, men are getting double the provision. The next thing you move on to is the fact that women need more toilets. So women are more likely to be accompanied by children or the elderly, which will make them take more time. A huge proportion of women will be on their period at any one time, which again means they have to change their tampon or they have to change their pad. A certain proportion of women will be pregnant, which means they have to visit the toilet much more frequently. Similarly, women are more likely to have urinary tract infections, which again means that they're going to need to visit the toilet much more frequently. So you add all those things up, and providing double the provision for men suddenly seems completely inequitable. But again, it's something that seems fair on the surface. It seems fair, give men and women equal floor space, except men and women have different needs, so it doesn't actually work out as fair. Reference man appears hugely in occupational health research. The vast majority has been carried out on men and male-dominated jobs, which means that women are working with chemicals whose impact on their bodies is unknown, and using protection gear that doesn't protect them because it doesn't fit. And this goes for gloves, but it also goes for police body armor. In fact, there was an awful story of a woman, this was quite a long time ago, in the late 90s, a female police officer had to take off her stab vest in order to be able to use a hydraulic ram to open a door, and she was stabbed and killed. And you would think at that point, that's the point you create stab vests for women. But here we are, 2019, and there are still police forces that don't have them. There was a woman in Spain, actually, that was written up for buying her own stab vest because the regulation stab vest designed for reference man was not safe for her to use. But she wasn't allowed to use that. The next thing I just want to mention quickly is cars. Again, designed for reference man. The reason a woman is 47% more likely to be seriously injured and 17% more likely to die in a car crash than a man who is sitting beside her is that for decades we have designed car safety features around a car crash test dummy that represents the 50th percentile male. Now, the issue with that is that women are not the 50th percentile male. And so women sit in the car in what is called an out-of-position seating position. We're not in the standard position, which we kind of have to, in order to reach the pedals. It's quite an important part of driving, be able to reach the pedals. We also haven't developed a seatbelt that will fit pregnant women well, and fetal death from trauma, the number one cause of that is a car accident. Belatedly, regulators have realized that women exist. And so they did introduce what they call a female car crash test dummy, only it's not actually a female car crash test dummy, it's a scaled-down male dummy. But still, it's great for small men. But even with that, in the EU, they only test this female car crash test dummy in 1 out of the 5 regulatory tests, and only in the passenger seat. So basically just don't drive, women. That's the answer to that. Don't drive and don't use gender-neutral Bic pens. Very dangerous. Just quickly, I want to mention algorithms, because this is one of the most frightening areas that I uncovered while doing my research, because algorithms are dictating the future, and we have outsourced them to private companies who don't allow us to look at what their algorithms are doing. So we've essentially outsourced the future to private companies, and so far they are not doing very well. For example, job hiring software, 70% of CVs in the US never reach human eyes. And let me give you an example of why this might be a problem. So this researcher was speaking to a coder who had developed a platform for hiring coders. And they said they had found this really amazing correlation between people who visit a specific Japanese manga site and people who are really good at coding. And so people who visited this site got a higher score and were more likely to get a job. Well, the issue with that is that, as anyone who knows anything about the internet will know, a lot of these sites are not exactly very welcoming for women. So women are less likely to have gone to visit this. But also, as I mentioned near the start, women do 75% of the world's unpaid care work and have 5 fewer hours of leisure time per week. So they just don't have time to be going and hanging around on this Japanese manga site. So again, this thing that looks like this really exciting gender-neutral way of finding a really great coder turns out to be heavily biased towards men. And then you start thinking about, so, in hiring it's bad enough, but then you start thinking about medical data. Well, the medical data we have is so hopelessly biased, and human doctors are bad enough. But what happens when you have an algorithm trying to diagnose you, trying to treat you, especially given the way machine learning works, which is, as all the research shows, it gets better and better at making decisions based on the data you give it. Well, if the data you give it is biased, it's getting better and better and better at being biased. That is a scary future I don't particularly want to live in. So that's why I wrote this book, Invisible Women, because I want to challenge this male bias. So the other half of my life is the activism half, has been spent campaigning to increase women's representation in public spaces, whether on our banknotes, marriage certificates, or statues in Parliament Square. And I view this book as the natural extension of that campaigning work. Because when women aren't seen, we are forgotten. And when we are forgotten, we end up poorer, sicker, and sometimes we die. So I want to challenge you, every single person in this audience, to look at your life and look at your work. And there is something that everyone can do, whether it's as basic as just starting to label the male when it's occupying the default spot. Things like say men's football when you mean men's football, which, let's face it, is what you mean most of the time. Apart from next week, which is the Women's World Cup, I've been reliably informed. So look at your daily life, look at your work, and think about what you can do to challenge the supremacy of reference man, because the truth is he does not have a superpower and he does not represent all of humanity. And by relying on him, women are dying. So it's time to kill him off. Thank you very much.